Hello, everyone. Today, we'll be discussing this research that was conducted by Wang et al. Now, this particular research, we come across this research while catering to the second section from the unit stress, that is measures of stress. About this particular research, we study this under the heading of biological measures of stress. Now, it's pretty important that we understand and we keep on reminding ourselves that stress cannot be measured directly. Why is it that stress cannot be measured directly? Because stress is a psychological experience. So, what we do is we use certain indirect measures to be able to figure out the level of stress an individual is experiencing. Now, these indirect measures could include a self-report study. This could include a self-report measure. This could also include a behavioral observation or any sort of biological parameter. So today we'd be trying to figure out the level of stress by using the fMRI. fMRI stands for functional magnetic resonance imaging. I'm sure you've heard of brain scans, and I'm sure you've heard of MRI, that is magnetic resonance imaging. Now, as we speak about MRI scans, they typically of two sort. Number one, the structural MRIs, which help us figure out the structures or the different parts of the brain, and at the same time, we have functional MRIs that help us understand what the particular part of the brain is that is active when we performing any particular task. So one, we if we talk about the psychology being investigated over here, the first one is using fMRIs, that is functional magnetic resonance imaging. Number two, we need to know what the term cerebral blood flow over here means. The word cerebral refers to or relates to the brain, and when we talk about cerebral blood flow, the idea over here is the parts of the brain where blood is where the part of the brain where the blood flows actively when you're performing a particular task. And uh, yeah, so we speak about fMRIs, we speak about cerebral blood flow, and we talk about individuals having to go through a mathematical task. Now, these mathematical tasks that we're referring to over here, they could be broadly put into two categories. Number one, a low stress task, and then we speak about a high stress task. So let's begin. We're talking about the study that was conducted by Wang et al. In the year 2005. Wang et al. Used fMRI scanning devices to examine cerebral blood flow in participants under physiological stress. fMRI, what is it? It is a scanning technique that is used to measure in the brain by tracking the changes in the oxygenated blood. Now, what fMRI does is it tracks the changes in the oxygenated blood. When a part of the brain is active, it requires more oxygen, so there will be increased cerebral blood flow, like I mentioned earlier. And cerebral blood flow, we'll be referring to this as CBF. Brain areas shown by the fMRI to be most active in response to stress include number one, the amygdala, number two, hippocampus, number three, hypothalamus. Do you need to learn them? Learn them if you think it's easy for you to learn them. If not, let them be. So, quickly moving on towards the sample over here. And I believe it is important for us to have a basic idea on the sample because knowing the sample well can help us evaluate the study in terms of methodology. So this study consisted of 30 participants. Initially, there were 32, but two of the participants were eliminated from the experimental group for having incomplete behavioral data and having abnormally high salivary cortisol. So initially the participants were 32, but towards the end there were just 30 participants who were used, whose data was analyzed towards the end. So we're talking about a study where we had 30 participants. 23 of these participants were in the experimental group and 7 of the participants were in the control group. If we talk about further bifurcation over here, the experimental group comprised of 11 females and 12 males with an average age of 24 years, whereas the control group comprised of 4 females and 3 males with an average age of 23 years. Now, if you have a look at the sample, we very clearly see that we don't have a very disproportionate sample over here because in the experimental group, there is one male more than a female, and in the control group, this has been pretty much compensated, but by there being one female there as compared to the males in the control group. So the average age looks pretty similar as well. For the experimental group, like I said, the average age is 24 years. For the control group, the average age is 23 years. So within the experimental group, like I had said, there were initially 32. Two of them were eliminated because of the reasons I mentioned a minute ago. None of the experimental group had none of the participants from the experimental group had any history of any neurological or a psychiatric disease. And this, of course, would add on to the amount of controls the researchers had over this particular experiment, which consequently adds on to the credibility of the research, which consequently increases the internal validity of the research. So we are talking about using fMRI technique, and these individuals, they'd be made to go through scans, and while they're being scanned, the experimental group would have to go through a task as well. So if we speak about the procedure of this particular experiment, each group had to go through 4 MRI scans, and each scan was of 8 minutes. Note the amount of precision. The more precise or the more controls that experiments have in their experimental procedure, of course, it adds on credibility to the research. So the 4 scans that were taken over here, number one, the first scan, which we refer to as the baseline scan, this would help the researchers have a reference point baseline. In other words, we may refer to this as the initial point or the initial scan. The first scan comprised of the first scan, this was before the task, and this we're referring to as the baseline measure. The second scan, we refer to this as a low stress task. Now we're talking about the experimental group here, okay? So the second scan, we refer to this as a low stress task. And as we speak about the low stress task, the participants were expected, or they were asked to read aloud or count aloud backwards from 1,000. So it was something as simple as 1,000, 999, 998, 997, 996, and it goes on. So this is a very low stress inducing task. Moving on, the third scan was during a high stress task. And for this high stress task, there was a 4-digit number. Let's just say for now, we consider the number 7654. And participants were asked to subtract 13 from that particular 4-digit number. And they were asked to answer aloud, and they kept on getting prompts to answer back quickly. So they kept on receiving speed prompts, and just in case if they made a mistake, they were supposed to start it all over again. So you might as well just pause this over here and try doing this on your own. You'd realize that this does end up causing stress. Any 4-digit number, just keep on subtracting 13 out of it really, really quick. Imagine there's this loud speed prompt that you're receiving, which pressurizes you to do it faster every time. The fourth scan, we'd also refer to this as a baseline measure. This was the reference point to compare. So for the experimental group, we're talking about 4 different scans over here. Alongside this, there were other measures that were there was other data that was collected as well. For instance, number one, there was a self-report. There was a self-report measure, and through this self-report measure, an individual's stress and his or her anxiety levels were being measured as well. There was a scale used. You may refer to it as the Likert type scale. And of course, if you're talking about a scale, you'd be collecting quantitative data, and all the advantages, the disadvantages, the pros and cons that you can think of about quantitative data can and should be put to use here. One, there were MRI scans, being more specific, fMRI scans. Number two, we had self-report measures where the individual stress levels and anxiety levels being measured. Number three, saliva samples were obtained. And through these saliva samples, the researchers wanted to check or to test the cortisol levels of the participants. And cortisol is a hormone. It's more popularly referred to as a stress hormone. After the tasks, participants were asked to rate in terms of the amount of efforts they had to put in during either the low stress task and the high stress task, how frustrated did they feel, and the task difficulty. And again, there was a scale used over here where two endpoints from 1 to 9. This would again help us gather quantitative data. Alongside the fMRI scans, the self-report measures, the saliva samples, there was another objective measure, a biological measure of heart rate as well. And Heart rate was figured out through using a pulse oximeter throughout the study. The timings of cortisol level collection was kept the same. It was standardized. It was decided to collect the sample between 3 to 5 p.m., which would, of course, control for any sort of natural fluctuations in cortisol levels based on the particular time of the day. So this is another control that would add on to the internal validity of the research. Now, I'd like to assume you're all familiar with what the procedure was like for the experimental group, right? Now that you've understood what the procedure was like for the experimental group, just subtract the tasks part, that is the low stress part task and the high stress task for the control group. So they both the groups, that is the experimental group and the control group, they went through the same procedure more or less. It was just the task, the high stress task and the low stress task that was removed for the control group. So taking this ahead, if we have a look at the results real quick, the results of this study were as expected, as hypothesized by the researchers. It was expected that the self-reported stress as well as anxiety as well as heart rate and the cortisol levels, they would increase during the high stress task. And guess what? It actually did happen. So the self-report measures showed that the participant felt more stress, they felt more anxious. If you have a look at an objective measure, if you have a look at the heart rate, yes, they had a high heart rate. Yes, the cortisol levels were high when they were going through the high stress task. These measures return to baseline after the stress ended, whereas when you talk about cortisol levels, they usually take a bit. We're talking about dealing with humans, and these cortisol levels, it took around 10 minutes to decrease. If we speak in terms of brain activity, the ventral right prefrontal cortex. You might as well just mute this. I'm sorry, not mute. Pause this over here and learn the word. Prefrontal cortex, or we're talking about the ventral right prefrontal cortex. What is this? This is a part of the brain that is linked to negative emotions. This is linked to sadness. Just remove this over here because it's written already. So the ventral right prefrontal cortex, that is RPFC, was because it's linked to negative emotions, sadness, fear, vigilance to threats. This showed the study showed an increase in the CBF during stress, and it was in this part. So, uh, going on with the results over here, higher self-report stress was where the participants, they experienced higher right prefrontal cortex activity. There was high amount of stress reported by the participants as well, and this pretty much shows a positive correlation. This shows a positive correlation between higher activity in the right prefrontal cortex and the participants reporting experiencing high levels of stress. If we speak in terms of RPFC, that is right prefrontal cortex, again, higher or greater RPFC activity was also found to be linked to number one, higher salivary cortisols and higher self-reported anxiety. So this was adding to your stress, this was adding to your cortisol levels, this was also adding to your anxiety levels. If we have a look at the statistics over here, not that you're expected to learn all of them, but then just to give you a tiny little idea, remember, the participants were asked through a self-report measure to rate from 1 to 9 the amount of efforts they would they felt they put in while they were going through the low stress task and the high stress task, the amount of difficulty they experienced and how frustrated did they feel. Now, if you talk about a comparison, we see that for the lower stress task, there is less of effort, less of difficulty, and less of frustration as compared to the higher stress tasks. Taking this further, the right prefrontal cortex or the ventral right prefrontal cortex activity remained high even after the stress ended. Now, what does this suggest? This suggests that the psychological stress leads to a prolonged state of heightened vigilance and emotional arousal. So, the high level of activity in the right prefrontal cortex, what does this suggest? This suggested that psychological stress leads to a prolonged state of heightened vigilance and emotional arousal. Now, quickly, let's move on towards the strengths and limitations of this particular study. Of course, you need to know more of this to be able to write or to be able to answer a 10-mark evaluative question. But for now, number one, to begin with, the measurement technique is objective using fMRI is objective and there's close to none interpretation that is required, or relatively less interpretation that is required, which of course adds on to the validity of the research, which of course adds on to the credibility of the research. The second advantage, in addition, as opposed to a blood sample or a saliva, in addition, as opposed to a blood sample or a urine sample, if you talk about uh, measuring stress through cortisol levels, that is by using your saliva sample, that is relatively convenient, that causes less of discomfort as compared to using blood samples, that is invasive, and urine samples, that's of course not everyone would be comfortable with that. So in addition, as opposed to blood samples, saliva sample collection does not require the collaboration of a skilled person, allowing for an uncomplicated and trouble-free sample collection. Now, when there are strengths, there are limitations or weaknesses as well. The act of going through fMRI in itself could be stressful for people. The fMRI machine or the MRI machine or the MRI brain scanning device machine equipment that if you've seen it, the mere act of having to go through the procedure might induce stress to some people, and which could have possibly affected the cerebral blood flow. Now, this is a confounding variable that we cannot do anything about. So, like this reads, the act of going through an fMRI may have an effect on the cerebral blood flow, which could be a confounding variable. This could cause more of stress. One. Moving on towards the weakness, the second weakness, one issue to identify though is that stress mechanisms which trigger a physiological reaction can only indirectly be assessed by salivary cortisol measures. This is something that I had measured right at the beginning of the lesson. Stress cannot be measured directly. We cannot measure stress directly. The only way for us to be able to measure stress is either by using self-report measures, or there's any behavioral observation, or any biological parameter that we over here used as salivary cortisol levels. So I hope this has been helpful. Thank you.